John Locke and Ralph Cudworth were born both in the same county in the same generation. Both were discipled in some way by Benjamin Whichcott. Both of them loved Damaris Cudworth, albeit in very different ways. And crucially for my presentation today, both Locke and Cudworth wrote about innate ideas. Cudworth's treatise concerning eternal and immutable morality was the most complete defense of innatism in the 17th century. While Locke's first section in his essay became the classic rejection of innate ideas. And yet, despite their parallel time, place, and love of the same woman, the two never got the chance to turn and face each other on innatism. One would hope that since Cudworth began his treatise around 1662, this would have given Locke decades to respond to it. Alas, Cudworth always found reasons to avoid publishing, and his treatise was only released posthumously in 1731. One would hope that the two might have met when Locke began fraternizing with Cudworth's daughter Damaris Cudworth in the 1680s. Alas, Locke fled England in exile, communicating with Damaris only long distance in what bordered on love poetry. One would hope that when Locke published his essay and returned from exile in 1689, this could have occasioned their meeting, especially since Locke subsequently moved in with Cudworth's daughter, along with her either very understanding or very oblivious husband. Alas, this happened in 1689, and Cudworth died in 1688. One would hope that Cudworth's unpublished manuscript would have been in Damaris's house, where Locke spent the rest of his life. Alas, it was Cudworth's son, not his daughter, who received the manuscript in his father's will. Alas, 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 the tale of Locke and Cudworth is littered with so many near misses, with these tantalizing moments of the two almost meeting and discussing innatism, as if fate were being a tease. And while many believed John Locke won the 17th century fight over innate ideas, there was no fight in the first place. Or at least, not the fight that people deserved, for the most comprehensive defense of innate ideas in the 17th century was not published until the 18th, long past the death of Locke as well as the expiry date for optimum readership. Today, I intend to imagine how such a meeting might have gone, putting Locke and Cudworth into conversation about innatism. This will serve as a historically stimulating speculation, at least hopefully stimulating, as well as a philosophically interesting case study in its own right. The first section of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding famously rejects innatism. Now, much of the traditional defense of innatism was based on certain universal truths that all humans allegedly held to. And if these truths were held universally despite different sensory experiences, then they could not come from the changing circumstances of the sensory world, but had to be innate to the human mind itself, which guaranteed that all humans had these ideas in common, regardless of their different sense experiences across time, place, and culture. Thus, universal consent and innatism had become partners in crime. But this partnership is what Locke attempts to break up. Locke protests that there are not, in fact, such universal principles, noting that children, idiots, savages, in his words, and illiterates go their whole lives without ever articulating, say, the law of non-contradiction. Such, quote, general propositions are seldom mentioned in the huts of Indians. Have there not been whole nations whom the exposing of their children and leaving them in the fields to perish by want or wild beasts has been the practice? And are there not places where, at a certain age, they kill or expose their parents without any remorse at all? There are places where they eat their own children. So, if ideas are innate to the human mind, why don't all humans everywhere acknowledge these universal truths? Where, oh where, asks Locke, is that truth universally received? But what is interesting about Cudworth's account of innatism is that it doesn't rely on universal consent. For example, different individuals can see different shades of color, and colorblind people can see no colors at all. This proves that color is not in the sensory world itself, but in the mind that perceives it. So in this case, it is precisely because the quality of color is not universal that it must be innate to the individual's mind. In Cudworth, it is often the non-universality of innate ideas that makes them valid. For while one can either be right or wrong about eternal truths, sense experience is not capable of being disproved, for, quote, all appearances as such are alike true. So, even if an experience points to nothing objectively beyond itself, it is still true that you are having this experience. As such, for Cudworth, the lack of consensus often suggests we are onto something more real than superficial and universal phenomenon, for such experience cannot be argued with. In fact, by the end of the book, Cudworth is willing to dispose of universal consent altogether, writing that even if humans were discovered on other planets who did not agree with us on a single thing, this would still not be cause to question our innate notions. Thus, Locke's critique of universality, considered by many to be the battering ram of empiricism, cannot even make it to Cudworth's door. But if Cudworth's argument is not solely based on universal consent, then what is it based on? For Cudworth, it is not universal consent that proves an idea innate. Rather, it is because only like can know like. One can only know what is already like, and in that sense the same as, their own mind. The mind, quote, cannot know anything but by something of its own that is native, domestic, and familiar to it. For Cudworth, that which is truly other and unlike us cannot be known at all. For if it were knowable, this would suggest some continuum between us and it, which could be traversed in order to come to know it. But then it was never truly other in the first place, for there was some common ground all along, some like terrain that could be tread to reach it. In Cudworth's own words, that which wholly looks abroad outward upon its object is not one with that which it perceives, but is at a distance from it, and therefore cannot know and comprehend it. But knowledge and intellection doth not merely look out upon a thing at a distance, but makes an inward reflection upon the thing it knows, and according to the etymon of the word, the intellect doth read inward characters written within itself, and intellectually comprehend its object within itself, and is the same with it. End quote. An overly simplistic, but perhaps still helpful illustration would be that of other cultures. They may seem other from us, but We can come to know and accept each other by embracing our common humanity, by realizing we aren't truly other at all. But in contrast, genuine unlikeness, genuine otherness, would be closer to a two-dimensional entity attempting to conceive of a three-dimensional one, or a logical mind attempting to conceive of a square triangle. Beating Kant to the punch, Cudworth lists numerous categories of the mind, including cause and effect, that sketch the limits of our reality. For how could we perceive objects in space and time unless we ourselves thought in temporal and spatial categories? Unless that which is within our mind were already like that which is outside of it. Now, Locke could here employ the same response he gave to the dispositional and immediate assent accounts. Apparently, I've just engaged the microphone for the first time. Had not been using it. Locke could give the same response he gave elsewhere to different accounts. Locke could retort that if only like can know like, then this would render not only morality or logic innate, but the entire pantheon of knowledge as well. Must the mind have a like notion of Lincoln's death to discover he was shot in a theater on April 14th, 1865? I mean, this could go on ad absurdum, for as Locke writes, by that same reason, all propositions that are true may be said to be in the mind and to be imprinted, so that if the capacity of knowing be the natural impression contended for, all the truths a man ever comes to know will by this account be every one of them innate. Thus, Cudworth proves little by proving too much. If like knows like is true, all things would become innate, in which case, innate becomes an absurd designator of nothing specific at all, and it's pragmatically indistinguishable from a non-innatist account. Now, Cudworth's work suggests three ways he might have responded to this Lockean objection. First, while Cudworth believes qualities are innate, he does not seem to believe that quantities are. I might have an innate notion of the color blue, but it doesn't mean I know how big the waves will be tomorrow. The brain has all the puzzle pieces, but only experience can show us how they are actually put together. Thus, not all would be rendered innate, and the contingent realms of history, science, and experiential knowledge could still have their place. But Locke could still retort that if the principle of like knows like truly holds, then it would apply not just to the qualities, but to the quantitative mixtures of those qualities. In order to allow certain types of knowledge to escape the clutch of the innate, Cudworth must defy the principle of like knows like in some small way. But if small violations are allowed, why not bigger ones? And these are difficult questions to answer. But they seem just as difficult for Locke as for Cudworth. Indeed, the same accusation could be turned back on Locke's line between primary and secondary qualities. For Cudworth argues in proto-Berkeleyan fashion that even matter could be reduced to innate qualities in the mind. Cudworth even suggests that hell may simply be an eternity locked up in one's own mind, tormenting ourselves within the hell of our own heads. We can thus have physically stimulating dreams and hallucinations without anything externally present, potentially reducing all primary into secondary qualities with any arbitrary line between them drawn merely for the sake of whichever empiricist or innatist system is under discussion at the time. If distinguishing between what is in the mind and in the world is indeed a problem, it would seem to be equally a problem for both Cudworth and for Locke. Now, a second possible defense from Cudworth is that we do not innately know everything. For some things are unlike our mind, and so genuinely unknowable. If not everything is like us, then like knows like does not render all things innate, because there are things that aren't like us. Cudworth hints at this on multiple occasions, writing that we do not always know, quote, things in themselves, and that outside the realm of innateness, many things are eternally unintelligible. Thus, there are in Cudworth inklings of what could anachronistically be deemed the noumenal. And as long as there is a noumenal realm that is unlike us, the principle of like knows like need not render all things innate, thus sidestepping Locke's potential critique. Finally, even if these two defenses fail, Cudworth could blithely retort, so what? Cudworth seems quite comfortable embracing an all-encompassing idealism. Locke's threat that like knows like renders everything innate is like threatening to beat the masochism out of a child. It does not have the desired effect. Cudworth seems eager to relocate more and more into the mind, as much as he possibly can. And yet, while Cudworth does believe we discover truth within ourselves, this idealism does not make reality entirely relative to us. For Cudworth, knowledge is in, but not of, the human mind. He writes, "Now the plain meaning of all this is nothing else, but that there is an eternal wisdom and knowledge in the world, necessarily existing, which was never made, and can never cease to be or be destroyed." Or, which is all one has to say, that there is an infinite, eternal mind necessarily existing, and that actually comprehends himself, the possibility of all things, and the verities clinging to them. In a word, that there is a God, or an omnipotent and omniscient being, necessarily existing. If all the color and juice of reality is a thing of the mind, then without an everlasting mind, reality is nothing but a subjective plaything of human fancy. Indeed, Berkeley's response to Locke was anticipated by Cudworth, who says, quote, "There must of necessity be some one universal mind, the article and exemplary cause of the whole mundane music. There must be a sun that never sets, an eye that never winks." Now, Cudworth does not think this divine idealism would negate Locke's beloved science, but rather prop it up. For, quote, "Men could not possibly confer and discourse together in that manner as they do, presently perceiving one another's meaning and having the same conceptions of things in their minds, if all did not partake of one and the same intellect. Neither could one so readily teach and another learn, if there were not the same actival stamps of things in the mind both of the teacher and the learner." For Cudworth, the common language of science is provided by the mind of God, in whose image we are made and so commonly share in as siblings. Now, Locke could obviously retort with some glee that divine idealism is a return to an argument from universal consent, where all share in universals through the mind of God. But there is a certain sense in which Locke also believes in universals, the universality of material science. Of course, this is not an innate universality, for not all cultures have practiced science or acknowledged its basic principles, and yet, the empiricist believes that if one is properly educated in the sciences, that these taught principles will become clear, which would be functionally indistinguishable from a dispositional innatism. The beauty of science is precisely its universality, that any person across the globe could go out and repeat an experiment and get the same results, a point that Locke alludes to on multiple occasions. Locke writes of such universal consent regarding an array of notions, including solidity, number, pure space, existence, and unity. In other places, he even explicitly refers to certain notions as garnering, quote, universal assent. Thus, both Locke and Cudworth ultimately admit some form of universal consent, however explicit or inexplicit in their theories. And so, since this universality is conceptually consistent with both the innatist and empirical accounts, it cannot be used as the deciding premise to prove one over the other. Similarly, if two applicants for a scholarship have equal grades, then grades alone cannot be the deciding factor. And this may actually lean in Cudworth's favor. For remember that Cudworth's argument does not need universal consent as a premise, but he can merely draw the existence of universals as an implication of this argument. No, the true justification for Cudworth's position does not come from universal consent, but from the powerful premise of like knows like. In contrast, empiricism often relies on universal consent as the premise for its validity, for it is precisely the ability of a scientist in Geneva to test the results of one in London that proves the alleged objectivity and supremacy of empiricism. Ironically, any critique of universality might be far more damning to an empiricist who relies on it as the premise for their worldview than for Cudworth, who can merely use it as an outflowing implication of the principle of like knows like. And since both accounts embrace universality, it is therefore doubly valid for Cudworth to maintain it as a concluding implication, while being invalid for Locke to use it as a premise arguing one side over the other, for it is consistent with both accounts. In conclusion, Cudworth's use of like knows like not only provides an alternate epistemology to Locke's, but does so while sidestepping the Lockean critique of universality, which, as it turns out, could perhaps be turned back upon empiricism itself. Yet, due to Cudworth's hesitation to publish, Locke did not have the chance to wrangle with the most comprehensive defense of innate ideas in the 17th century. Had the other side of that tale been told, perhaps history would have seen that Cudworth's critique of empiricism, which re-emerged in Kant's transcendental philosophy, deserved a much better hearing in its time. Armstrong echoes this sentiment, writing, with perhaps some overstatement, that, quote, Locke's rejection of the innate idea theory is somewhat unfortunate. For if Locke had not been so adamant about innate ideas, the suggestions of Moore and Cudworth regarding the active role played by the mind could have been developed in 18th century England. As it turned out, however, this development was to wait for Immanuel Kant.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We've got time for one or two questions, I think. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this. I was interested in something when you were describing the story about colors or something, how they're not shared. I was just sort of maybe thinking of Descartes' comments on a certain broadsheet, this response to Regius, and sort of interesting. Descartes looks like he has a sort of version of this likeness principle before Berkeley. And so I was thinking about the likeness principle, and I want to try out a sort of line for Locke and see what you think about it. It seems like for this Cudworthian like only can know like story work, or Berkeleyan like can only know like, you need a story about kinds up and running, and so you need a story about the nature of the mind and the nature of the world. And then you need some kind of incompatibility between them, right? So you need them to be exclusionary concepts, as they are in like Descartes. it seemed to me that that's something that Locke is going to be pretty reticent to get on board with, right? So he's pretty skeptical about the nature of the mind. And so I was just curious about that sort of line of argument and what you think Locke or Cudworth might think about.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that. I'll come back to you in a couple of years. Yeah, I mean, this is the crucial question, right? Is the mind corresponding to the external reality? And I think Cudworth ultimately believes it is, but he also seems willing to admit that it doesn't have to be, and he hints at perhaps the raw matter and stuff of reality, which he doesn't really consider necessary for truth. It more knocks at the things in your mind that awaken truth. I think he might be willing to call that an unknowable thing, except perhaps in as much as they're revealed in the internal qualities of the mind. But yeah, I don't. He's not going the full Kantian route where you just say, nope, we can't know the things out there. Like, he still, through his theism, has this correspondence. We pivot from God to the world, between the mind and the world. He still has that, even though there's inklings at times of something numinal. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. Just on the principle of likeness, does Cudworth say anything about how we are supposed to arrive at that particular principle? Like, is it, for example, is it a self-evident first principle or something like that, or is it like a Cartesian principle where you could obviously perceive it or something like that?
No, that's a great question. I'm trying to think of something that I could quote. I think for him, he sees it as this sort of traditional position going back as far as the Greeks. So it's just this momentous principle that for him is at the heart of philosophy to some extent. I'm trying hard to think of where he actually justifies it, though. That's a really good question. I can get back to you on that.
The reason I ask is just because if it's similar to the likeness principle in Berkeley, there's lots of debate in Berkeley social about whether it's just meant to be obvious or whether it's meant to be something that's justified.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. We can talk about that more later.
No, thank you. What does Cudworth say on the fundamental assumption of the scientific experimental method, that an experiment actually tells us something about the objective external world, which requires an assumption that, well, several assumptions, one of them is the uniformity of experience through time and space, etc. Does it say on this?
Yeah, I think Cudworth, and to some extent the Cambridge Platonists as a whole, are really uniquely situated because they're wanting to take seriously science, and they're engaging with it, but they're also not scientists. And some of their use of the sciences, especially Henry Moore, is just irresponsible. Which I can say because I'm working on him now. It feels like he's my family, so I can insult him. And so they want to take it seriously, but they want to constantly remind you that you can only take it seriously if you have this starting rationalist, Hellenistic framework in order to get there. And, well, I think if you ask them, they would articulate that they do take it seriously. And to some extent they do. And, Cudworth is one of the first people engaging with atomism seriously on a theological level. I think at times the tension between their views becomes apparent in inexplicit ways. So, yeah.
This is wonderful. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let's all thank Jonathan.